Kia ora katoa. Well, this feels very strange. This feels strange for a lot of reasons. I've lectured in this room so many times, but it's nothing like tonight, I assure you. I don't usually wear this gown or even a tie. First time lecturing a tie. I normally have probably a tenth of the attendance in this room, so that's really unusual, but it's great. This is what it used to be like when I came here 15 years ago teaching an undergraduate class, which was full like this, and just the energy, it's amazing. It's different now because of online learning and recorded lectures, but it's great to, I think, probably have one last experience of lecturing in front of people. It's a different lecture because I'm not going to ask you any questions about the content. There's no test or exam at the end of it. You're not allowed to ask me questions either. So this is an old school lecture. It's old school because I'm going to read this. So I have prepared my words of wisdom or not, and I'm just going to get on and read it, and hope that you stick with me along the way. It's about 45 minutes. All right, I'm actually going to weave a little bit of personal stuff as well, because those experiences that I've had have kind of led me to the research that Mike very kindly introduced before. I feel very lucky to be a university academic because we're encouraged to teach and research, and I can't see what I'm reading, what we're passionate about. My research is personal and it's also political, not in the sense of political parties, political in the sense of desiring change, that we should stop perpetuating these myths of management, that we should teach management differently at school, university, and in management and leadership programs in the workplace. And most importantly of all, that we should do management differently. Now, I realise that is a very grand ambition. More realistically, I hope we can pause and reflect on some of the taken for granted, common sense views of what good management is. So where to begin? I was very interested in business when I was young. Firstly, because of my brother John, who's here tonight, who launched a small business making covers for musical cassettes. And then my brother-in-law Simon, who got me interested in the share market. This was the mid-1980s, and I had great fun with my father Barry, who's in the front row here, buying shares in high-flying companies like Chase Corporation and Judge Corp. And they're not so much fun watching them crash and burn following the 1987 market crash. In my sixth form year, or year 12, as my kids would know it, I was chief executive of our school's young enterprise company, which ran a tuck shop and produced school-crested umbrellas and sweatshirts. And here I am in this shot with Sir Alan Hellaby at the awards presentation in November 1989. Alas, I would not become the tycoon of tomorrow. When I left school, I had no interest in going to university, somewhat to my parents' surprise, I think, having been put through an expensive private school education and performed well academically. I'd studied journalism at school. I liked writing and I liked the pressure of deadlines. So I enrolled in a journalism course at Auckland Institute of Technology. And 24 weeks later, I emerged with my certificate in journalism and a job as a reporter at the Taupō Times. I was young, still 17, and moving away from home to a town where I knew nobody seemed a big step. It was 1991. The Employment Contracts Act was being introduced, undermining the power of trade unions, and the economy was in deep recession. Minister of Finance Ruth Richardson delivered her so-called mother of all budgets, cutting the welfare state and introducing user pays, the start of her reforms not so fondly known as Ruthanasia. Journalists are not well paid now, and they certainly weren't then. My weekly pay was $275, paid in cash, but I was grateful to have a job. At the end of my journalism course, I was the only one of 25 graduates to have found one. Less than 2 years later, having told my parents that I had no interest in attending university, I enrolled at the University of Auckland and moved back home, and I've been at university ever since. I was still interested in business and enrolled in a Bachelor of Commerce. I also enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in political studies. Growing up, my parents had been active in their local National Party branch. That was exciting because from 1975 to 1984, our local MP, Robert Muldoon, was New Zealand's Prime Minister. And here he is celebrating election night 1975 with his wife Thea and my mum sitting in the front row here as well on the left. In my business courses at university, I was starting to have some serious doubts about what I was learning. In marketing, my textbook said that marketing exists to satisfy the needs and wants of consumers. It seemed to me that marketing didn't just satisfy our needs and wants, it helped create them, and through advertising convince us that we should satisfy those needs and wants by purchasing the product. I had bought the marketing textbook at the second-hand shop and intended to sell it there at the end of the course. There wasn't an opportunity on that course to debate the definition of marketing. I just had to memorise it. So I started writing my critique of the material in the margins of the textbook. It helped relieve my frustration, and probably naively, I thought I would educate the person who bought it off me. In my study of management, what I was learning didn't explain very well my experience at the Topol Times. The textbook was written by Stephen Robbins, an American, and the world's best-selling textbook author. The book's message was that the employment relationship is a consensual one, that owners, managers, and employees work together to achieve a common goal, that being a productive and profitable organisation. I could relate to this perspective because in Taupo we had a competitor newspaper, the Topol Weekender. All of us at the Topol Times wanted to be number one. But Stephen Robbins' textbook did not speak to other parts of my work experience. Within 3 weeks of starting at the Topol Times, I was caught up in an industrial dispute. The company that owned us, Independent Newspapers Limited, wanted to reduce the annual leave entitlement for new staff from 4 weeks to 3. I was told by colleagues that I should join the union, which I did. I learned a valuable lesson from that experience. While I shared with the paper owners the common goal of trying to be the best newspaper in town, we also had interests that collided. Shareholders, understandably, wanted a better return on their investment, and in a recession where unemployment was high, management had decided that was best achieved by reducing the working conditions of staff. As a rookie reporter, I felt in a powerless position arguing with the owners of a publicly listed corporation. I was grateful I had the union on my side. My management textbook at university, 700 pages long, did not once mention the word union. It shone no light on that real-world experience of work. The textbook assumed that the goal of managers was to maximise profits for their owners. This grated with me because I got to know well the manager of the Topol Times, Kevin Webb. In that dispute over annual leave, I knew Kevin was conflicted. He had a directive from head office that he was expected to implement, yet he knew this would make his staff, who he cared about, worse off. It annoyed me that in my management course there was no opportunity to debate these ideas. The assignments were all about what managers should do to maximise productivity and profit. In one assignment I argued this shouldn't be the objective. The marker said that I hadn't answered the question and I got a low grade. This created a dilemma for me because I was very concerned about getting A's. I soon worked out that if I stayed within the ideological boundaries of the field, I would get high grades. Now, for some of you, describing a textbook as ideological might be a controversial claim. Aren't textbooks based on scientific research? Aren't they unbiased and objective? Stephen Robbins, the author of my undergraduate management textbook, gave a revealing interview when he was asked, "Do you see your textbooks as propaganda? Do you see them as ideology?" And here is his response. "I see my books as supporting an ideology, but of course all textbooks sell an ideology. Organisational behaviour books, for the most part, support a managerial perspective. This reflects the market, business schools. We need to genuflect the gods of productivity, efficiency goals, etc. We reflect business school values. In my political studies courses, I also learned that staying in the ideological lane paid dividends. But in those courses, it was helpful if I positioned myself as left-wing, in the sense of believing in the important role by government to constrain market forces. One of the skills I honed at university was working out the ideological views of the lecturer and feeding that back to them in assignments. It got me the A grades I desperately wanted, but I didn't like it. I didn't believe a university education should be about socialising students into a particular worldview. One of the reasons I became a journalist was I loved the idea of the media as the fourth estate, holding those in authority to account. And here I was at university and had an authority, my lecturers and my course textbooks, telling me what I should think. Here is section 268 of the New Zealand Education and Training Act, the legislation that grants universities the ability to confer degrees and charge fees. I wasn't aware of this legislation when I was a student, but it nicely captures what I expected university to be about. Section 268 lays out the distinctive characteristics of universities, what makes them different to other providers in the tertiary sector, polytechs, wānanga, private training establishments. I've highlighted in bold 2 points. The first, that the principal aim of universities is to develop intellectual independence, to be exposed to a wide range of perspectives, to use those perspectives to generate different ways of understanding the world, and to think critically about the strengths and limitations of all perspectives, and ultimately to form our own judgments, to get an education, to learn how to think, not be told what to think. Now to the second point in bold. Universities in New Zealand, and we are unique in the world for this, have a legislated requirement to accept the role as critic and conscience of society, to do research and develop expertise, and to use our relative independence as an institution within society to hold those in power to account in our teaching, in our research, and intervention in the public arena. It's a similar idea to the fourth estate role of the media that attracted me to journalism. It's also important to note what is not mentioned in this section. There is no mention that the distinctive role of university is to train people for jobs. That's the role of others in the tertiary sector. A training is what I got studying journalism at Polytechnic. I learned how to type, how to take shorthand, how to interview, and how to write a story, so that on my first day at the Taupo Times, I knew what to do. It wasn't an education. I was never invited to consider the role of journalism in society or other deeper questions. There was no scope to form independent intellectual judgments. The distinction between training and education shapes how I teach management. I don't set about to train students how to be managers. That's not to say I don't want my students to get good jobs. I'm trying to develop generic skills that employers find valuable. Analytical skills, critical thinking, communication and creativity, and developing those skills through the study of management. So what has all this got to do with my research? The textbook I reacted against as an undergraduate student 30 years ago is still the world's biggest selling textbook today. Robbins' management textbook is now in its 20th edition. And while it is updated with contemporary concerns and current cases, at its core, it hasn't changed much. It still assumes that the purpose of studying management is to be trained to be a manager. It still looks from this managerial perspective, and it is still trying to socialise students into a singular and narrow ideological view, what Robbins calls business school values. And that still annoys me. So for the past 15 years, working with my colleague here at the School of Management, Stephen Cummings, together with collaborators here and overseas, including some excellent postgraduate students, I've dedicated my research time to busting myths about management ideas represented in these textbooks. Management is a young field. It's not a real academic discipline like psychology, sociology, or philosophy. To gain academic credibility, it has created a history filled with famous names from other disciplines. Adam Smith from philosophy, Max Weber from sociology, Kurt Lewin and Abraham Maslow from psychology, to name a few. None were writing about management, yet their ideas have become foundational theories of the field of management. Sadly, their ideas have been misrepresented. They've been taken out of context, twisted, and filtered through business school values. These ideas that bear little resemblance to what those theorists wrote concern how to motivate and lead people, organise work, develop culture, and transform organisations. They shape how we manage staff and how we are managed by our bosses. I argue these myths of management serve us poorly, contributing to dysfunction and damage in our organisations. We can do better than this. We can teach management differently, and we can do management differently. I want to start with a simple but important distinction between history and the past. A conventional view of history is to see it as a factual, objective account of what happened in the past, why it happened, and who was important in making it happen. I take a different view, defining the past as events that have occurred, and history as a story or narrative of those past events. The past cannot speak for itself. History is our connection to the past. The producer of history must make decisions about which events to highlight and which to relegate to a minor mention or omit altogether, which people to give prominence to and which to exclude. The point is that we can create many different histories of the same past. Histories are subjective, not objective. Those who get to produce history are influential. They shape our understanding of the past. In my research, I treat management textbooks as histories of management. Textbook authors and publishers make decisions about which people and their ideas to include and which to leave out. They represent those ideas in particular ways. They shape our understanding of what management is, and they shape, therefore, our expectations of how we will be managed and how we will manage others. One of my earliest projects with Steve was to contribute to a debate about why there are so few genuinely new ideas in management. We argued that our field is limited by its history. We surveyed the most highly regarded journals of management and business history to examine the geographical locations they focused on. We coded more than 2,000 articles and produced this map of the world to represent the data. As you can see, two Anglo giants, the US and UK, dominate. Australia, New Zealand just about hold their own, while Africa, Asia, and South America shrink to slivers. This picture of where management ideas comes from tells only part of the story. Two African-American colleagues of ours, Leon Preto and Simone Phipps, have shown how the contributions of African-American men and women have been almost completely excluded from America's management history. The same has happened in this country, with the contributions of Māori largely excluded. Independent Newspapers Limited, the company who owned the Taupō Times, is now called Stuff, the popular news website. 2 years ago, they issued this apology to Māori. They acknowledged their newspapers were started by European settlers and written for those settlers. They reflected their worldview, promoted their interests, and in doing so, disadvantaged Māori. For example, they perpetuated the myth that Māori knew nothing of trade and business until it was brought here by Pākehā, despite there being a thriving Māori economy before colonial settlement. This is the limits of history. Our view of the past is limited by the histories that we have. They shape our understanding not just of the past, but the present and possibilities for the future. But thankfully, if we accept the distinction between the past and history, then history is not fixed for all time. We can create new histories. And that's what I did with Steve and these two colleagues from the UK in this book, A New History of Management, that had quite possibly the least diverse author team ever. I guess I was slightly younger and my hair at that time slightly browner, but that's about the only difference. It's a source of embarrassment now, actually. While the book got some excellent reviews, some traditional management historians were not fans. I think they missed our point that we were offering a new history of management, not the new definitive history that should replace theirs. We wrote the book to encourage others to write histories from places and people excluded from the conventional history of our field. I'm pleased to see that 6 years later, there are researchers around the world doing that work. They are changing that map of the world I showed earlier. My own contribution to this broader project is to focus on management textbooks, exploring the origins of the most well-known theories. It's not heavily theoretical or intellectually sophisticated. I actually describe it as academic journalism. One of the things that journalism taught me was to think carefully about who your audience was and how to engage them. I want my research to be widely read. I want it to make a difference. I want to make it difficult for textbook authors to keep publishing management myths. So the research works like this. Select a well-known theory, analyse how textbooks present it, compare it with what the theorist actually wrote, develop an explanation for how and why those misrepresentations happened, and explain why it matters. Published in a well-ranked academic journal, but don't stop there. Promote the work shamelessly on social media. Cultivate relationships with journalists in the mainstream media in the United States who want to write feature articles, and send the research to textbook authors. Make it hard for them to ignore it. Now, in the overview of this lecture, I mentioned lots of theorists whose work is misrepresented: Adam Smith, Frederick Taylor, Max Weber, and Abraham Maslow. To ensure we have time for food and drink afterwards, I won't talk about them all. I'll focus on the area of leadership and change. These are two big topics in management, and it's the area where I see the most damage caused by management myths. The foundational theory of change management is Kurt Lewin's unfreeze, change, refreeze model of organisational change. Lewin, one of the world's most famous social psychologists, died in 1947. If you haven't heard of Lewin, don't worry, I think you'll be familiar with his idea. The theory states that organisations are hard to change. They tend towards a steady state. The task of leadership is to unfreeze them, to create an understanding that change is necessary. That requires a vision and skills to overcome those who are resistant to change. Once the change is implemented, the leader needs to refreeze the organisation so the change becomes the new business as usual. This project started with a conversation with Steve. We'd both taught the model for years, but had never been able to find Lewin's original writing on it. To cut a very long story short, despite being a prolific writer, Lewin only ever wrote one paragraph on change as 3 steps, and it wasn't about organisational change. One way to illustrate the myth is through French and Bell's popular textbook, Organisational Development. The 5th edition says Lewin introduced 2 ideas that have been influential since the 1940s, change as 3 steps and his force field analysis. But they made no mention of change as 3 steps until 1990. They didn't mention it before then because it didn't exist before then. Change as 3 steps was developed in the 1980s, more than 30 years after Lewin's death. The model makes assumptions about leaders and followers and about the nature of change. It reinforces the heroic portrayal of leaders as highly skilled, powerful people who can change organisations according to their desire. The model assumes that change is necessary and in the best interests of the organisation. It also implies that only leaders can see the need for change. Other employees can't and are likely to resist it. The change leader's job is to overcome this resistance, to drive the change down through the layers of the organisation. Lewin was a psychologist, not a management theorist, although he was involved in one major study of corporate change. This study concluded that change was most successful when those affected were meaningfully involved in designing and implementing the change, rather than it being determined by a small group at the top of the organisation. I think Lewin would be horrified by seeing his name attributed to this model. So why was a model developed by others decades after Lewin's death misleadingly attributed to him? A new subfield of change management, where organisations are transformed by senior executives, emerged in the 1980s to challenge the field of organisational development, which had humanistic and democratic values. This new subfield of change management needed a history to give it credibility. Lewin, one of the 20th century's most respected social sciences, was the ideal choice. Change as 3 steps, seemingly common sense, academically proven, and relevant to managers. It ticked all the boxes, providing just the kind of content that management textbooks were looking for. So why does the myth of Lewin's change as 3 steps matter? It matters because it's the foundation of many modern change models, including the most well-known John Cotter's 8 Steps for Transforming Organisations. It supports a whole change management industry where experts are brought in to unfreeze, change and refreeze organisations. The model reinforces what has become taken for granted, common sense ways of thinking about change. When I teach leadership, I start by asking students about the difference between leadership and management. Leadership, they generally say, is about having a vision, charisma, inspiration, courage, self-confidence, and strength of conviction. Management is about compliance, process, giving orders, and formal authority. Management textbooks reinforce this view. Have a look at this diagram from a best-selling textbook. Note how it creates a binary distinction between leadership and management. See also the value judgment that it places on leadership and management. Leaders are seen in a positive light, confident, seizing opportunities and making things happen. The descriptions of managers are negative. They are threatened by new situations and wait for things to happen. When I show this diagram to students, I ask them, who would you prefer to be? A leader or a manager? Unsurprisingly, with this description, nobody wants to be a manager. This diagram is from a textbook called Management. It's used on Management 101, Introduction to Management, in the School of Management. It's a curious feature of management as a field of study that it has evolved to a point where it denigrates the very occupation that bears its name. Managers, according to this representation, are losers. So, let's summarise the picture of change and leadership that we learn from management textbooks. Change and leadership are interconnected. Leaders are people who create change. In contrast, managers can't or won't change. Change should be implemented in organisations from the top down. Leaders create the vision for others in the organisation to follow. Let's now look more closely at a foundational theory of leadership, and then I want to say a little bit about resistance to change. Probably the most influential leadership theory today is transformational leadership, created by political scientist James McGregor Burns in the late 1970s. Burns, through his historical analysis of American presidents, distinguished between transactional and transformational leadership. He was sick of transactional politicians who engaged in pork barrel politics, effectively buying votes and campaign contributions with promises of subsidies or new infrastructure. Burns wanted transformational leaders with visions of a brighter future that inspired and engaged voters. Transformational leadership was for Burns moral leadership because followers choose their leaders. He says, ultimately, the moral legitimacy of transformational leadership is grounded in conscious choice among real alternatives. That's his emphasis. Remember, Burns is a political scientist. Candidates articulate their visions, and those who are voted in are held accountable at the next election for their performance. Transformational leadership is, in essence, a democratic process. Burns's theory had little impact in political science, but it's had a huge impact in management studies. Transformational leaders are heroic, inspirational figures whose visions of the future inspire employees, resulting in employees working harder, being more committed to the organisation, and ultimately generating higher levels of performance. Transformational leadership is a theory of politics translated for business. But one critical aspect of the theory got lost in translation, conveniently and quietly forgotten by those who introduced it to management studies. The democratic essence of the theory, that the moral legitimacy of transformational leaders comes from being voted in by the people they lead. When I ask people what they value most about living in this country, many will say democracy. So why don't we extend this to work? We love living in democracy, yet we spend much of our week at work in some form of dictatorship. Of course, there are arguments against more democratic organisations. Employees usually don't have an ownership stake in the business, and therefore shouldn't be trusted with a vote. They might vote in leaders who will give them pay rises or go easy on them, or they don't know enough about the business and its environment to choose the best leader. My proposal for more democracy at work might sound a little crazy, but let me point out the damage and dysfunction that results from these myths of changes 3 steps and transformational leadership. To prove oneself as an organisational leader today, you require a vision for transforming it. You have to make your mark. Many organisations are damaged by transformational leaders appointed from outside the organisation to implement their grand vision. They generally don't understand the organisation, they alienate the people who know it well, and they don't stick around long enough to see their changes through. In short, they are not accountable to the people they lead. And worse, they get their next job on the basis of having transformed the last organisation they were at, irrespective of the success of those changes. They use the organisation as a stepping stone on their career path. The organisation and its people get walked over. I've taught many MBA students, some of whom are here today, and thank you so much for coming. And I've experienced it myself. They've experienced it, I've experienced it. I don't blame these transformational leaders. They were, it seemed to me, good people. They were just doing what they were expected to do. They were just enacting what we define strong leadership to be. We'd be better off thinking again about what strong leadership is and thinking again about its nonsensical assumption that change is necessarily better than the status quo. I've talked so far about theories that are brought into management studies from other disciplines and how they get twisted and filtered through the ideological values of our field. But I'm also interested in theories that are relevant to our experience at work, yet don't get included in management textbooks. I learnt about Stanley Milgram's classic obedience experiments studying psychology as an undergraduate. Conducted at Yale University in the 1960s, participants in Milgram experiments thought they were taking part in a study on the effects of punishment on learning. They were given the role of teacher and ordered by a man in a white lab coat to administer electric shocks to a learner strapped in a chair, beginning at 15 volts and increasing after each incorrect answer to 450 volts. The studies were designed to see how far participants would go before refusing to obey. The results surprised Milgram, with 65% continuing all the way to 450 volts. How could such extreme levels of cruelty by otherwise decent people be explained? Milgram theorised it as obedience to authority. In the debrief after the experiments had finished, participants said they were not responsible. The man in the white lab coat was to blame. I was just doing what I was told. My social psychology textbook celebrated Milgram and those who disobeyed authority. It takes great courage, as we can see from this famous image from Tiananmen Square in 1989. Social psychology teaches us that we are particularly susceptible to the dangers of authority at work. Sometimes we're asked to do something by our boss that is unethical, for example. It's hard to say no. We put at risk our chances of promotion and maybe even our job. Curiously, my management textbook was full of social psychologists like Kurt Lewin, who I've discussed already, but it didn't include Milgram. Why not? After all, Milgram's experiments are regarded as the most famous social psychological research of all time. Research I've published this year compares the coverage of Milgram's experiment in psychology and management textbooks. Robert Barron has written both best-selling textbooks in both fields. His social psychology textbook devotes many pages to Milgram. He went to high school with Milgram's niece and writes about the dismay he felt when she told him about her uncle's experiments. Barron's career took him from psychology into management. The coverage of Milgram's experiments in the first edition of his organisational behaviour textbook in 1984 was a copy and paste from his social psychology textbook. Yet in the second edition, Milgram was gone, and he wasn't mentioned in any subsequent edition. So I contacted Barron to ask why. I said, in your psychology book, you say we must learn about the dangers of obedience to authority, especially at work. You say it is our duty to disobey. Barron explained that the reviewers of the first edition said that Milgram was off target for management, that it didn't fit within the field of management. So he followed their advice and removed it. This crystallised everything that I'd experienced as a student back in the 1990s and all my research on management textbooks for the past 15 years. Academic fields have ideological commitments. Social psychology has an ideological commitment to self-determination and resistance to authority. Milgram's experiments validate this, but they do not fit with the ideological commitments of management studies, what Stephen Robbins calls business school values. Management textbooks want students to obey their bosses, not disobey them. Management textbooks say they want to teach students to think like a manager, but by excluding Milgram, I argue they're really wanting to socialise students to be compliant employees. Why does this matter? Our organisations need employees who are prepared to challenge people in authority. That is really hard to do, because for most of us, through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, in the home, at school, at university, and at work, we are encouraged to respect authority figures and be compliant followers, and we generally get rewarded for this. We can't expect employees to go against the grain and speak up. We must cultivate organisational cultures that encourage and reward this behaviour. The focus of my research is how we teach management to students. I started this lecture by talking about my experience as an undergraduate. It didn't explain well my own experience of work at the Taupo Times, and I didn't like being socialised into business school values. It wasn't for me what a university education should be about. 30 years later, I still draw on that experience to inform how I teach management today. I don't use a best-selling textbook to teach my students. I use this book, which I wrote with Steve Cummings. It's not a bestseller. I teach management in a way that I wish I'd been taught it, in a way that is consistent with the distinctive characteristics of universities enshrined in legislation. To cultivate intellectual independence by exposing students to radically different ways of thinking about organisations and society, from free market capitalism to Marxism. To teach students how to think critically by encouraging them to critique their textbook, my book, like I did as an undergraduate, and to encourage students to be creative, to draw on their own experiences of work and management ideas from their own places and cultures. Hopefully my obsession with management textbooks isn't merely an academic exercise. If we can teach management differently and those students take that knowledge with them into their careers, maybe we can, over time, do management differently. So what changes would I like to see? I would like organisations to be less like cults, where challenging your boss is taken as a sign that you care and are courageous, not a sign that you're a problem employee. I would like organisations to be more democratic, to make our experience of work genuinely empowering. Empowerment is too often a management buzzword that has been stripped of any meaningful sense of handing over authority. I would like the people trusted with leading change to know the organisation, care about the organisation, and stick around long enough to be accountable for the success or failure of those changes. I would like leaders to implement fewer change initiatives. It would help reduce change fatigue and cynicism, the two most prevalent responses to change. I would like top-down change to be the exception rather than the norm. We can change organisations from the bottom up. One illustration of this is how organisations are adapting to the fluidity and fracturing of gender. The people driving those changes are our young people, and they're doing it from the bottom of the organisational hierarchy. Organisations could listen more to their young people. It's easy to think with age comes wisdom and that we oldies know best, but I have the privilege of teaching young people, and they understand better than us the challenges we face, especially climate change. Now, I want to finish back where I started with the distinction between the past and history. The lesson is that we can write many different histories of what has happened in the past. The history I've crafted in this lecture is one where I was destined to do this research. My experiences at the Taupo Times, my responses to the textbooks I studied in Auckland, one led to the next, it all fitted together perfectly. Articles published in highly ranked journals and the odd book or two along the way. It's a great story. I could have crafted a different history. I could have talked about being so lonely both in Taupo and at Auckland because I didn't go with my friends to university straight from school. I could have talked more about being an insecure overachiever, striving desperately for the highest grades to feel good about myself. I could have written about the imposter syndrome I felt as a new PhD student at University of Cambridge, or about the struggles I had a few years after coming to Wellington, totally mentally and physically drained by raising 4 kids, amazing 4 kids here tonight, with Maria, getting my research rejected by journal editors who saw no merit in it. It was too journalistic, they said. I'm ending with this because I don't want to leave you with the impression that it was smooth sailing, or that I always knew what I wanted to do with my career. There's been doubts and tough times along the way, and in those moments it helped me to know that others had gone through tough times as well. For many years I didn't know where to focus my research. I've ended up a management historian of sorts, despite having never taken a course in history at school or at university. Finally, a few words about the future of the university. Many of you will be aware of the financial crisis facing this university and almost all others around the country. There's a lot of causes: COVID, the loss of international students, a broken sector funding model that hasn't kept up with inflation. But it's more than a financial crisis, it's an existential crisis that forces us to confront fundamental questions about our identity and purpose. What do we exist for? In my application for the Head of School of Management role early this year, I was asked to outline my vision for the school in a seminar to staff. The irony was that I had just finished a paper critiquing the idea that leaders are expected to have visions. But I needed one, obviously. So I said, let's do this. We don't talk enough about this because the university education has been progressively commercialised and commodified. Students are encouraged to think about their education as a financial investment that they need to generate a return on. Universities are encouraged to think about their degrees as products that can be sold to consumers. If we, the university, continue down this path, we undermine our case for government funding. We need to remind government that this is what you require us to do, and that requires your investment. Beyond finances, we're also facing a crisis about what we teach, given the development of artificial intelligent tools like ChatGPT. I reckon we have to prepare our students to do what AI tools can't, to understand and respect different views, to be critical, reflexive, and creative thinkers, to be human, basically. The good news is that this is our mandate, to educate students and be educated by them. For all of us, students and faculty together, to develop expertise and use that expertise to address the social, economic, political and environmental challenges that we collectively face. Ngā mihi nui.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to acknowledge Professor Todd Bridgman, Acting Provost Professor Mike Wilson, and all of you, a huge circle of guests from all walks of life here tonight. The University, and particularly the Wellington School of Business and Government, is proud to host you all for this treat of a lecture and the celebration of Todd's well-deserved professorship. I'm Professor Jane Bryson. I'm the Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government, or Ororiki, and I won't even begin to speculate about whether a Dean manages, leads, or muddles through. I suspect I muddle through, nor in what fashion. But the lecture we've just heard clearly prompts all of us to reflect on what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and the alignment of our actions with beliefs and values about how we would prefer to be treated at work and in life. It's my distinct honour and privilege to propose the vote of thanks tonight to our colleague, Professor Todd Bridgman. Todd is a very hard act to follow, so I'll be brief. And really, I can do no better than quote from the beginning of the letter I wrote to the Promotions Committee when Todd applied for promotion to Professor. It said, freely and without recourse to ChatGPT, Todd Bridgman is the real deal. He is a dedicated, thoughtful, and very talented academic researcher, teacher, and leader. Yes, I used the L word. And an excellent colleague to all. Wellington School of Business and Government and the University are very lucky to have him on the staff. I would add particularly, as today he is not getting any younger. Today is Todd's 50th birthday. I'm sorry, Todd, that's a myth. In this inaugural lecture, Todd's taken us on a very personal journey of what has motivated him to question received wisdom, to expose underlying assumptions and ideological drivers which have filtered and distorted the intent of the work of researchers such as Maslow, Lewin, Taylor, Burns, Weber, Smith, and others. Not only does he bust myths, but he aspires and models better management and workplace practice in his teaching and in his own management. As a faculty, we are a group of 6 schools covering a host of disciplines focused on commerce, business, and government. By our very nature, we embrace a range of disciplinary perspectives, and we bring those to bear on examining the responsibilities and challenges of organising ourselves as communities and societies, of how we generate and distribute resources, of how we value and treat each other and our activities and contributions. What Todd has so ably highlighted tonight is the embedded ideologies that can drive our perspectives, such that even the well-intentioned person can end up unintentionally perpetuating an ideology through myths passed on and on until they are accepted as definitive. Todd is a critical management scholar, and through his craft, he shows us that we need to be thoughtful, to interrogate the driving values and assumptions underpinning theories, views, and practices, and that we can all do this as educators, as researchers, as workers, as citizens, members of communities that we wish to be fair and to thrive. So, as the only thing standing between you and the opportunity to get on with that, and the opportunity to celebrate Todd's great inaugural and his 50th birthday, I invite you to refreshments on the mezzanine floor, which you can access out the doors and up the central stairway, or people sitting up the top can access out the back there. And I say to Todd, ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you and congratulations on becoming a professor of a certain age. Let's show our congratulations once again with a round of applause.